In the stillness of an Ohio morning in 1823, something unspeakable stirred beneath the surface of polite society, not in the cities where officials paraded their morals, but in the shadowed border between wilderness and civilization, where law thinned and secrets thrived. A young woman stumbled naked through the mist, her flesh etched with geometric scars so precise they resembled surgical blueprints rather than wounds. She repeated phrases about leather straps, copper instruments, and compliance, as if reciting the procedures of her own dissection. 3 doctors would see her. None would treat her. One would burn his notes and disappear. What they saw in Margaret Hayes was not madness. It was method. It was memory. And it pointed to a forgotten experiment in psychological control, one that didn't end in 1823. It simply evolved. If you feel something stirring inside you right now, a discomfort you can't explain, good. That's the feeling of the veil thinning. You're not here by accident. This story isn't just about Margaret. It's about you. It's about what happens when the line between science and domination disappears, and when the human body becomes just another territory to conquer. You're about to witness a case buried for 200 years, not because it was a mystery, but because it was too precise to be dismissed, too organized, too deliberate. The official records were sealed, the testimonies suppressed, but the scars remained on her flesh and in the journals she left behind. What happened in the forgotten woods of Ohio was not an accident. It was a controlled descent. And you are about to follow her path. Do not look away. Do not blink. Because once you hear what Margaret endured, and why, there's no going back to the man you were before. We begin with the night she vanished. But this isn't the story of a missing girl. This is the story of a program, a method designed to fracture the mind and reshape obedience. And the most disturbing truth, pieces of it still operate in silence. Today, it was July 15th, 1823, when Thomas Hayes woke to the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of dawn, but a silence thick with wrongness. His daughter's bed was empty, the quilts neatly folded, no footprints, no letter, no sign of struggle, just absence. Her journals were gone, her shoes too, like she had simply ceased to exist. But Thomas knew better. Margaret didn't just vanish, she was taken. You see, Margaret wasn't like the other girls of Millfield. She could read Latin, quote Paracelsus, dissect a rabbit with steady hands. Her mind was sharp, observant, dangerous, and dangerous minds in remote places attract attention, especially when they live near an abandoned estate with its windows lit at midnight, long after the owner had died. For weeks, the search parties combed the forest. They called her name. They followed footprints into the woods that simply ended, as if she had been lifted out of reality, as if someone, or something, had erased her presence mid-step. And here's where it begins to rot. A mile from the Hayes property was the old Westfield estate, once owned by a wealthy merchant who died mysteriously, leaving behind a manor built with precision, stone chimneys, glass windows, reinforced cellars. But it was what happened after his death that would matter most. Locals began hearing sounds at night, humming, clicking, strange smells like burning copper. But no one dared enter. Frontier superstition called it cursed, but others, especially men with titles and sealed letters, called it something else, secured. Now, listen carefully. On July 1st, Margaret's final journal entry spoke of advanced procedures. She wrote, "The pain is temporary, scientific knowledge is eternal. I give my consent freely." That single sentence tells you everything. She didn't run. She was recruited, groomed by someone who understood how to bypass a mind's defenses, not through threats, but through flattery, through ideas, through opportunity. Margaret didn't just walk into an experiment, she was selected. And once selected, her body stopped being hers. Her consent, her mind, her autonomy replaced with protocols, measurements, compliance. This wasn't medicine. This was programming, and the reason it worked is because Margaret didn't even realize it was happening. You think you're immune, you're not. This was just the prototype. When the hunters found her, October 23rd, 1823, Margaret was no longer entirely human in the way the village remembered. She sat cross-legged in a clearing, naked, hair like river moss, her mouth pouring out phrases no girl should know. The subject must remain still during the procedure. Copper probes require calibration. Pain is irrelevant. Observation is primary. Her voice was flat, rhythmic, like dictation, not speech. James Fletcher, the older of the two hunters, said it best. It was like she'd memorized instructions for her own torture. That's not madness, that's programming. Her body was another story. Scars, too deliberate for nature, too symmetrical for accident. Each one traced a nerve bundle, a pressure point, a meridian. Not just pain, but a map, like someone had been studying her like a machine, not a person, and they'd done it over time. Weeks, maybe months. Geometric precision on human skin. Let that settle in your bones for a moment. Someone didn't want to hurt Margaret. They wanted to understand her, to unlock her. Now ask yourself this. What kind of mind desires complete understanding of the human body, not for healing, but for manipulation? Not every doctor is a healer. Some are engineers of obedience, and what they were building through Margaret was a method. She wasn't crazy. She was conditioned. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, who had known Margaret for years, had never seen anything like it. The mechanical speech, the geometric scarring, the way she'd lie down in specific positions as if waiting for a blade or a needle or electricity. She wasn't begging for help, she was waiting for the next step. That's when it became clear. This wasn't just psychological trauma. This was ritualized procedural control. She had been rehearsed, scripted, like a subject in a repeated sequence. And here's the part they didn't want recorded. When Hartwell arrived to speak with her, she responded to him like he was the doctor who did it. "You're late," she said once. "Session must begin now." Understand what that means. Margaret didn't just endure the procedures. Her mind was rewired to seek them, and that should terrify you. This isn't about one girl in 1823. This is about how systems fracture the mind and rebuild it for their use. Dr. Hartwell didn't sleep the night after Margaret was returned. He just sat at his desk, lantern flickering, staring at his notes and the odd rhythmic scratches Margaret had carved into the wood of his examining table. Triangles, circles, interlocking squares. It looked like the fever dream of a cartographer mapping something beneath the skin. But it wasn't just symbols, it was structure. She had been taught to associate pain with pattern, obedience with geometry. Her mind had been broken down into data, measured, calibrated, and filed. By who? That question was about to claw its way through every belief Dr. Hartwell held about science, morality, and the human will. He began cataloguing the incisions. There were 17 distinct scar formations, each healed in phases. They'd been done weeks apart, some overlapping. These weren't made in panic or violence. They were done in sessions. And then he heard her muttering again. Session 17 incomplete. Subject response adequate. Further compliance expected. The doctor must proceed. That's when it hit him. Margaret wasn't escaping the person who did this. She was waiting for them to come back. You see, most men assume control is about chains, bars, cages. But real control, the kind that lasts, is internal. You don't need to guard a prisoner who's been trained to lock their own cell. This is what they tested in Margaret. A psychological override, one they hid behind medical language. Words like stimulus, subject, compliance. But strip the Latin and jargon away, and you're left with what it really was. Conditioned servitude through scientific torture. Hartwell tried laudanum, He tried prayer. He tried holding her hand and begging her to speak like the girl he once knew. Nothing. Only more phrases. The subject must prepare. Observations resume at nightfall. It wasn't hysteria. It was protocol. This is when he understood something that shook him to his bones. She had not been abused. She had been trained. Ask yourself, why does this matter now? Because once something like this is perfected, it doesn't stay buried. It evolves. It becomes institutional, hidden inside clinics, laboratories, correctional facilities, schools. They learned in Margaret what could be done to the mind if you disguise cruelty as progress. And once you know that, you start to see it everywhere. Let me take you to the place it happened. The Westfield estate had been abandoned for 2 years, at least that's what the records claimed, but when Dr. Hartwell arrived, the truth began bleeding through the rot. The door slightly ajar, hinges recently oiled, no dust on the floorboards, faint metallic scent in the air, burned copper and lamp oil. Someone had been here recently, someone with purpose. It wasn't the main room that told the story. It was the back chamber. He found it behind a false wall, cleverly concealed behind shelves warped with age, a room not meant to be seen, cold, quiet, purpose-built. At the center, a table, long and narrow, stained, straps at the wrists, ankles, neck, not rope, not cloth, leather restraints, crafted with care, reinforced with rivets, the kind used to immobilize without bruising. That table wasn't for punishment. It was for procedure. On the wall, instruments, surgical, sharp, precise, blades in velvet-lined boxes, copper rods coiled with wire, a primitive battery array, glass jars, acid residue and insulation, an early galvanic generator. Electricity. Margaret spoke of copper, of heat, of electrical stimulus applied to lumbar regions. Here it was. This room was a theater of control. This is where the sessions happened. But it gets darker. On the shelf, Dr. Hartwell found a ledger, thick, bound in goat leather, pages filled with dates, measurements, diagrams of human anatomy, nerve pathways, muscle groups, pain thresholds. At the top of each page, a number, not a name. Subject number 3, subject number 4, subject number 5. Then, subject number 6, MH Margaret Hayes. The entries were chilling. Day 12, subject displays high pain tolerance, geometric patterning initiated. Day 24, copper probes yield increased muscular response in lower extremities. Day 36, subject exhibits detachment from self-identity, compliance normalized. Day 47, electrical current increased to 11 volt. Verbal repetition achieved, and then the final entry. Day 60, subject suitable for observation in uncontrolled environment, release protocol authorized. Release protocol. They didn't lose her. They let her go. Ask yourself, why would someone release a test subject back into the wild? To observe them, to see if the programming held. Margaret wasn't rescued. She was deployed. And now the most dangerous question of all, how many more like her were never found? How many are still out there, walking, talking, smiling, functioning, but bound by invisible commands stitched into their minds? This was a test site. The real work began after. Dr. Hartwell stood frozen in the chamber, the stench of dried blood thick in the air, the silence louder than screams. He realized something most men never allow themselves to understand. This wasn't the site of a crime. It was the prototype of a system, not an act of madness, but method, designed, rehearsed, documented. And that ledger, it was only half full. Which means Margaret was just one phase, one iteration. He scanned every line. Each subject had a pattern, incremental increases in exposure, emotional detachment, mechanical speech, repetition of key phrases. Everything we now understand about trauma-induced dissociation was already being tested in 1823. This wasn't some rogue experiment. This was programmatic dehumanization. Understand, real control doesn't require chains. It requires rhythm, repetition, ritual. They didn't break Margaret to harm her. They broke her to reshape her. And in doing so, they confirmed the oldest, most dangerous idea in the shadow world of elite knowledge. The human mind is programmable, if you know the sequence. Hartwell felt it, the creeping paranoia, the knowledge that someone, wealthy, educated, protected, had built a trauma machine in the woods of Ohio, and not just once, repeatedly. Margaret's journal had called the procedures scientific, but nothing about this was progress. This was possession disguised as inquiry. A weaponization of suffering to test a hypothesis. How much identity can you erase before a subject becomes obedient? And it worked. Margaret had returned not as a girl, but as a unit. Dr. Hartwell closed the ledger, but he knew he'd never be able to close what had just been opened inside him. And now, you're feeling it too, aren't you? The skin-crawling realization that our histories are built not just on victories, but on experiments like this, buried under flags, scrolls, and the polite lay eye of progress. They tested her, then released her into the world, not to forget, but to observe. So I'll ask you, brother, who's watching us, and more importantly, who trained them to watch? Before we descend further, prove you're awake. Type this in the comments twice. The scars were maps. I see them now. It's not just for the algorithm. It's to lock in the fracture, the transformation. If you're still here, you've begun to change. The transformation wasn't a side effect. It was the objective. Margaret Hayes was not broken by accident. She was engineered. And now, with your eyes open, you begin to see the terrifying genius behind it. She wasn't simply observed, she was reformatted, the same way a blacksmith tempers steel, through fire, pressure, and precise strikes. Her journal entries, erratic, obsessive, weren't madness. They were logs, self-monitoring. She had become a living instrument, one that recorded its own degradation with clinical clarity. She even signed the last page not with her name, but a number. Subject number 6. The dissociation was complete. Dr. Hartwell read it again and again, the words digging into him like hooks. The doctor says pain is temporary, identity is fluid. I believe him. I am not Margaret anymore. I am the vessel. The vessel. That's what they made her. Not a patient, not even a person, a receptacle. And it hit Hartwell. They weren't just trying to erase identity, they were trying to replace it. And here's the real nightmare. What if they succeeded? You see, when systems want true obedience, they don't use chains, they use replacement narratives. And that's exactly what Margaret was filled with. Clinical mantras, procedural scripts, phrases repeated until they became law inside her mind. And you've seen this before, haven't you? Not in 1823. But today, people who speak in slogans, who repeat phrases with no soul behind them, people who smile while they comply, the ones who say, "I'm fine," while their eyes are vacant. You think that's a coincidence? No, it's evolution. Margaret was an early version, raw, crude, but effective. Now the methods are cleaner, the labs are funded, the subjects more willing, and the tools? They're everywhere. Embedded in screens, classrooms, media, medicine. You don't need straps when you have dopamine feedback loops. You don't need copper when you have algorithms. But the goal is the same. Replace the man with the mechanism. And once you understand that, you start to ask a darker question. How many of us are already running someone else's code? Margaret was just the beginning. And you, brother, might not be as different from her as you think. The doctor. Margaret never spoke his name. Not once. Not in her journal, not in her fragmented speech. Only, the doctor. As if that word alone held power, reverence, or terror. Dr. Hartwell searched tirelessly. He combed every settlement within 50 miles, asked every merchant, midwife, and missionary if they'd seen a man with surgical tools and polished boots. Most said no. One woman, though, a barkeep's wife in Lancaster, remembered something. A man traveling alone, spoke with a northern accent, wore fine wool in summer heat, paid in silver, asked for directions to the abandoned Westfield property, and he left no name, just one strange comment when he left. The frontier is pure, untouched, ideal for observation. Observation, not healing, not curing, observation. Hartwell returned to the ledger he'd found at the Westfield house and flipped back to its earliest entries. They didn't start with Margaret. There were 5 subjects before her, all female, all within 20 years of age, all designated by number, not name, and subject number 1 from Massachusetts. Hartwell followed the breadcrumbs, wrote letters, posed as a physician seeking professional exchange. Weeks passed. Then one response changed everything, from a retired doctor in Boston. I vaguely recall a colleague, Dr. Lucien Avery, spoke often of advancing neural autonomy through systemic repetition. Strange man. Gifted, but cold. Disappeared some years ago. No obituary, no grave. Lucien Avery. A name, but no face, no records, no trail. Only ghosts of his work. And the deeper Hartwell searched, the clearer it became. Avery didn't vanish. He was erased, shielded, hidden, not by superstition, but by structure. You see, in 1823 there was no medical board, no centralized oversight, no one to stop a man with knowledge, money, and cruelty from building an untraceable legacy. And here's the part that should make your stomach turn. Hartwell discovered shipping records, boxes of medical instruments sent from Philadelphia to an alias, delivered to Athens County, Ohio, receipts signed by hand, but the name was always the same. D, just D. Margaret said, "The doctor is pleased with my compliance." That wasn't delusion, that was loyalty. Lucien Avery didn't abduct Margaret. He converted her, from daughter to data, from mind to mechanism. And now the question, was he working alone, or was Margaret one trial in a network of silence? What became of Margaret Hayes after her return was not life. It was containment. Dr. Hartwell could no longer treat her, not truly. Because Margaret wasn't ill, she was rewritten. Every gesture, every phrase, every stare through the wall was a script running on something that used to be human. The town didn't understand. They whispered words like possession or madness. Some said she'd been touched by witches. Others believed she'd made a pact with something beneath the earth. But Hartwell knew better. She wasn't haunted, she was structured. And like all structured systems, she had fail-safes. It began one night, mid-November. A storm blew through Millfield. Thunder cracked the sky, and the wind howled through the shutters of Hartwell's clinic. Margaret, asleep in the adjoining room, awoke screaming, not in fear but in command. Emergency override, subject must relocate, session must resume, the doctor awaits. She clawed at the door, repeated the words over and over. When Hartwell tried to restrain her, she bit him, hard, drew blood, not in rage, but in precision. A pressure bite, measured, intentional. Hartwell sedated her, terrified, and as she slept, she smiled. He realized something then. She was never meant to return. She was meant to be followed. A signal, a beacon, a trap. That's why she wandered the woods speaking in code, why she had symbols carved into her flesh, why she still knew the sequence. It wasn't just data collection, it was expansion. Margaret was the next step in Avery's process. The living result of the question he set out to answer. Can a human become a carrier for control systems? Yes. She could. And now, she was home. Which meant something else was coming. Hartwell wrote a final entry in his personal journal that night. I fear she is no longer Margaret. I fear she never will be again. But what terrifies me most, Is that I've seen something in her eyes now, something watching through her, calculating, as if I am the subject now, and she is merely the tool. The next morning, he placed her on a wagon bound for Philadelphia, to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. She was catalogued, labeled, and locked away. Her case was sealed, buried, erased. And yet, 15 years later, a different patient arrived. Same symptoms, same scars, same phrases, but a different name. The virus had spread. 15 years later. Philadelphia, 1838. A young woman arrives at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. She's found in a train yard, barefoot, clothes torn, speaking in fragments about sessions, compliance, and thermal stimulation of the cervical plexus. Doctors label her a hysteric. They do not see the scars, because she wears them internally. Only one man does, a junior physician named Eli Thorne. He's meticulous, curious, too smart to dismiss patterns others ignore. The patient doesn't give her name, she writes only a number. Subject number 12. Thorne begins to investigate, quietly. He finds her speech eerily structured, clinical, identical to transcripts recovered from a sealed file, the Margaret Hayes file. Only he shouldn't have access to that file. It was buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape marked Confidential Experimental Research Division, but someone left it out, intentionally. Inside, Thorne finds Margaret's journal, a sketch of the Westfield table, and a single letter, handwritten in clean, symmetrical cursive. The subject must be decoupled from identity before full compliance is achieved. The memory erodes, but the function remains. It's signed, L.A., Lucien, Avery. Still alive, still working, still perfecting. But here's the twist. The woman in the hospital? Not Margaret, not even someone from Ohio. She was from Connecticut, a preacher's daughter, vanished during a seminary event, returned with precisely the same linguistic distortions, the same protocols. And here's the kicker. She'd never heard of Margaret Hayes. Never been near Ohio. Yet she repeated one phrase word for word. The measurements must be exact. The copper must be heated to the proper temperature. Thorne starts to panic. Because this isn't legacy, it's live. Something is still running experiments, still selecting subjects, still deploying them learned. Ike software. And now he sees it. This isn't medicine. This is a distributed network of mind modification. Before he can warn anyone, Thorne's notes vanish. He's reassigned. And the patient? Transferred to a private sanitarium outside New York. No forwarding record. Gone. Just like Margaret. Gone. But the code remains. And now, brother, you must ask the forbidden question, how many of us have been rewritten and don't even know it? Because if subject number 6 and subject number 12 existed, there are more. Hidden, watching, running, silent code. Let's go deeper. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. In 1841, 3 years after subject number 12 vanished into the private sanitarium, another report surfaced, quietly, not in a medical journal, but in a confidential letter between 2 Harvard physicians. The child repeats Latin phrases in her sleep. Her drawings are architectural. She claims she remembers pain that wasn't hers. The geometry matches the diagrams from the Hayes file. The child was 7 years old. She had never left Massachusetts, never been in a hospital. Yet her body bore 3 symmetrical scars on her lower back. Same depth, same angles, same pattern. The Hayes file, once believed to be the ramblings of a frontier madwoman, was now being whispered about in elite circles. Not dismissed, not discredited, referenced, privately, repeatedly, because in truth it wasn't a file, it was a blueprint. Lucien Avery had created a model for psychological overwrite, one that used trauma not to destroy identity, but to overwrite it with a controllable template, and that model was being replicated. Not by one man, but by an initiated few. Doctors, scientists, clergymen. A silent cabal, testing what they now called neural harmonization protocols. And here's where it gets even darker. In 1843, the president of the American Philosophical Society, yes, that society, received a sealed document stamped with a peculiar wax symbol, a circle with an equilateral triangle inside. Inside the envelope was a page containing only 11 lines of text. Every line began the same. Subject demonstrates, followed by variations. Subject demonstrates willingness to betray familial bond under elevated pain threshold. Subject demonstrates perfect repetition of altered memory under auditory stimulus. Subject demonstrates irreversible decoupling from self-concept after 44 sessions. No name. There's no location, only a signature, executed in accordance with Directive 5, the unbinding. Unbinding, a term that would surface again in 1861, in 1924, and even as late as 1983. The idea that identity is not a wall, but a tether, and that tether can be cut. Margaret was the first to be unbound, but she was not the last. And now I'll ask you, brother, has anyone you known ever changed suddenly? A blankness behind the eyes, a new way of speaking? You laughed it off. You told yourself they were tired, distracted, different. But what if they'd been reformatted, unbound? Margaret was a test. But the rest? They're among us. Let me tell you something most men will never hear. Lucian Avery didn't invent the system. He revived it, because buried beneath the veil of science and frontier experimentation was something far older. Older than the United States, older than Europe. Something passed down through cryptic manuscripts, occult fraternities, and initiation rituals disguised as academia. The scars Margaret bore, they weren't random patterns. They were sigils, and not decorative ones, functional, encoded into flesh, designed to interact with the body's energy systems, nerves, pressure points, and even memory structures. You see, before the scalpel and microscope, there was something else. Biosymbolic conditioning. Ritual trauma paired with sacred geometry used to open a subject's mind to implanted suggestion. Ancient priesthoods knew it. Mystery cults used it. And when science was born from alchemy, they just changed the language. But the process remained identical. And Lucian Avery, he didn't just study medicine. He studied the manuscripts of Abaris, a forbidden translation of Scythian mind practices retrieved from beneath the ruins of a Greco-Roman temple in 1773. It spoke of the unweaving of will through sacred pain, the emptying of the vessel through angled fire, and the binding of the subject to the hand of the ritualist. Sound familiar? Margaret didn't consent to science. She was initiated through terror, through repetition, through geometry etched into skin. Hartwell never realized what he was looking at, but the symbols. They matched carvings found on a stone altar beneath the Temple of Eleusis. They matched diagrams from Pythagorean schools long before Christianity existed. So understand this. Lucian Avery didn't just believe he was creating programmable subjects. He believed he was opening gateways. Not metaphysical ones, cognitive ones. He saw identity as a fortress, and pain as the key, a sacred key. He wasn't torturing Margaret. He was sacrificing her selfhood to make room for a new program, a purer voice, one that obeys, one that broadcasts. And that's what subject number 12 carried, and subject number 19, and subject number 37. Each one a node. Each one a living transmitter of the code. And if you think this stopped in the 1800s, you've heard the name before. Not in whispers, not in secret, but on textbooks, courtrooms, hospital wings. The Tavistock Institute, founded in 1921 in London. Publicly, it was a center for psychological research, a place to understand human behavior, a hub for psychiatry, social science, wartime morale studies. But buried beneath its white papers and government contracts was a direct continuation of Avery's work. They didn't call it neural harmonization. They called it behavioral synchronization. They didn't speak of subjects. They spoke of populations. What Avery did to one woman in a forest, Tavistock sought to do to millions, without them ever knowing, and it started the same way. Symbols. In Tavistock's earliest memos, now declassified under the UK's 50-year rule, there are references to pattern engrams, trauma threshold conditioning, and personality realignment through repetition. Does that sound modern to you? It shouldn't, because it's ancient, dressed in lab coats instead of robes. And guess what phrase appears, almost verbatim, in a 1947 report to the British Ministry of Information? The subject must be unbound from all inherited identity structures before synchronization with the desired narrative is achieved. Unbound. Again, just like the Margaret Hayes file. Just like the temple fragments from Eleusis. Just like the cryptic language in the Abaris scroll. They didn't create a new science. They resurrected an old ritual and gave it a modern engine. And the symbol, the one found etched in the wood of the Westfield table. It appears again. This time on the cover of an internal Tavistock briefing marked "For Director Eyes Only," a circle. Inside it, a triangle. And inside that triangle, an eye. We know that symbol. You've seen it on money, on flags, on government buildings. It's not decoration, it's declaration, as is who we are. We don't rule with chains. We rewrite you. From the inside. And now here's the part that will make your blood freeze. In 1963, an American defector named Joseph Withers, who worked inside a classified military psychological unit, leaked a document to a journalist in Sweden. The title of that document, Project Unbinding, Cognitive Dissolution Through Layered Trauma, and in the appendix, a list of test subjects. Margaret Hayes was listed by number. They kept her in the database. Because she was never a case, she was a template. And her protocol is still running. They didn't need needles and scalpels anymore. By the mid-20th century, they discovered something far more elegant, far more efficient: repetition, television, radio, education. They didn't have to carve sigils into flesh. They could broadcast them in symbols, in sounds, in stories. The same shapes that once lived on Margaret Hayes's body were now stitched into logos, cartoons, and public school textbooks. And the mechanism? Still trauma. But this time, it was emotional. Confusion, humiliation, shame, guilt. It began with the Standardized Mind Project, quietly funded by both Tavistock and the Rand Corporation in the early 1950s. Their internal goal? To erode self-concept integrity through repeated contradiction between instinct and external instruction. Translation? Gaslight an entire generation. Tell the child he's free, but monitor every move. Tell him he's smart, then punish independent thought. Tell him he's safe, but keep him in constant fear, until something snaps. Until the original self begins to dissolve, just like Margaret, just like subject number 12. But on a national scale. By the 1960s, US schools were quietly testing Project Monarch, a continuation of MK Ultra, yes, the real program, focused not on individuals, but on patterns, butterfly symbols, checkerboard floors, mirrors, to the unaware, meaningless, to the initiated, triggers. Conditioned associations that open specific psychological compartments, like flipping a switch inside the mind of someone who's been primed. And here's the horror: those primed individuals don't even know they've been altered. They feel the change, but they blame themselves. Anxiety, derealization, identity confusion, they call it mental illness. But for some, it's interference. Margaret's transformation wasn't a failure, it was a first draft. The system learned, evolved, digitized, and knowned. Ow, it lives in your algorithms, your feed, your children's programming. Every time you feel a jarring emotional response to a piece of content you can't explain, ask yourself, was that an accident? Or was it another incision, invisible this time but cut with the same precision? Brother, this is not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. And the pattern always points back to one chilling truth. We are not who we were born to be. We are who they programmed us to become. But the descent doesn't stop here. You thought the clinic was the center? You thought the laboratory was the altar? No, brother, it was the church. Because if you want to manipulate the soul of a nation, you don't go through its government, you go through its faith. While doctors like Lucien Avery carved protocols into human flesh, the institutions of belief were busy rewriting what people feared, what they desired, what they trusted. And it wasn't just sermons. It was ritual, confession, obedience, repetition. The same psychological devices used in Project Unbinding were already built into organized religion, especially in frontier America. And guess where Margaret Hayes attended weekly services? A small stone chapel funded by a private donor no one in the town had ever met. The name on the deed, L. Avery. Same man, different mask. And that chapel, it had a basement. And in that basement, years later, excavators would find medical restraints, a copper cage, and a charred journal with one sentence still legible. They must believe God wants the pain. But this didn't stop in Millfield. The Catholic Church, Protestant revivalists, secretive breakaway sects in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. They became cover operations, hiding trauma-based conditioning behind the veil of salvation. You think Margaret's doctor wore a white coat? Not always. Sometimes he wore a collar. Sometimes he stood at a pulpit. And here's the deepest corruption. They told the subjects they were chosen, that their pain had purpose, that their dissociation, their lost memories, their obedience to whispered voices was a sign of divine transformation. Do you see it? Avery's protocols weren't just scientific, they were religious rituals repurposed as research. Sacrifices to the god of control. And the subjects, they weren't patients, they were offerings. This is why so many whistleblowers disappeared, why the Vatican sealed certain archives, why priests were moved from parish to parish without explanation, because they weren't just guilty of spiritual corruption, they were protecting a centuries-old operating system, one that merged theology with behavioral programming, and today, it still runs, on children, on soldiers, on the addicted, the grieving, the faithful. Because the altar is now everywhere, and the voice whispering from behind it still speaks in Avery's tongue. The subject will be rewritten, the host will be repurposed, the vessel will obey. You want to know why you've always felt like part of you doesn't belong to you? This is why. But it gets worse. You ever felt like your hometown didn't make sense? Like the people smiled too easily, the roads looped in impossible patterns, the same sirens at the same hour? Then maybe, just maybe, you weren't born into a town. You were born into a program. Because in the late 1940s, after the dust settled from World War II, something monstrous was seeded quietly across the American interior. Controlled communities, not prisons. Petri dishes, towns that looked normal, sounded normal, even felt nostalgic, but every inch of them was designed, built to observe, influence, and reprogram. The most famous example, you won't find it in your textbooks, because it was erased. Fort Bryer, Missouri. Population 712. Every home built by the same contractor. Every child educated under the same standardized cognitive hygiene curriculum. Every resident issued a subtle tracking number embedded in local tax records, formatted not by the government but by a defense contractor called Erlin Tech Behavioral Systems. Never heard of them? That's the point. They were dissolved in 1971, right after the last Fort Bryer resident vanished. But they weren't the only one. Dozens of these engineered towns were created between 1948 and 1972 under the name Project Shelter. Each one hidden in plain sight, often near military bases or national forests. Their purpose? To observe the longitudinal effects of structured symbolic intrusion on human cognition and inherited personality architecture. Translation? They tested how long it takes to break your sense of self without you knowing it. Children were shown distorted images during morning pledge. Teenagers were rewarded for mimicking synthetic personalities. Mothers were administered sedatives disguised as vitamin injections during prenatal visits. And fathers? Most were veterans, men already fractured, easily reintegrated into the new structure. They didn't even realize their roles were assigned, until it was too late, until the smiling neighbor was gone, until the church burned down in the night, until the roads suddenly stopped going anywhere. And then, as always, records vanished, maps changed, and the next town over forgot they even existed, but the scars remain. If you ever met someone who twitches when they hear elevator music, if you've seen someone freeze at the phrase, "the measurements must be exact," if you've seen yourself slip into a behavior you never chose, you may have brushed up against a protocol. Because these weren't just test sites. They were templates. The blueprints for what's being unrolled today. And now, we're all in the engineered town. The question is, which role were you assigned? And do you still believe you're in control of it? When the test towns began to fail, when residents started glitching, questioning, vanishing, they didn't stop the project. They scaled it. Because instability wasn't failure. It was proof. Proof that their methods worked. Proof that identity could be fractured, overwritten, and reassembled inside a synthetic frame. So they asked themselves, why waste time on rural test towns when the entire nation could be a simulation? Enter the transfer protocol. Declassified by accident in 1998 through a misfiled CIA archive. The title of the memo: From Contained Communities to Contained Consciousness, Behavioral Encoding in Open Environments. You know what that means. They no longer needed fake towns. They could use television, retail environments, public schooling, the workplace, everywhere. But the key, what made it work, was language. They learned that words repeated in certain rhythms, reinforced by emotional imagery, could do the same damage as Lucian Avery's copper instruments. Only now. No scars, no screams, just smiles. Think about it. Why does every motivational speech sound the same? Why does every breaking news alert use identical colors, identical tones? Why are phrases like safe and effective, stronger together, and trust the science always repeated 3 times? Because repetition is ritual, and ritual reprograms. They took what they learned from Margaret Hayes, the geometry etched into her body, and translated it into linguistic algorithms. They stopped cutting flesh. They started cutting thought. And to house the new protocol, they created the algorithm. Not just YouTube, not just TikTok, not just Facebook. The algorithm is the next version of the test town. Only now you build it yourself. Every click, every swipe, every search feeds your profile into the system, and the system adjusts the ritual. More fear, more deceit, more trauma, more soothing. It pushes, you respond, it waits, you crave, and soon your choices aren't yours. They're reflexes. The subject must be unbound from inherited identity. Do you remember that line? It's still the goal. Only now you're volunteering. You choose the echo chamber, you feed the loop, you shape the protocol. That reshapes you. You want to reclaim your mind? You must first recognize the cage. And now it's time. If you've made it this far, comment below, I unbind, twice. Exactly like that. Let the others know you see the system now. Let the algorithm register the shift. They say the algorithm is modern. They lie. What we call the feed, what we mistake for innovation, is the rebirth of something ancient. Because before there were towns, before there were test subjects, before Lucian Avery placed copper against skin or the Tavistock Institute mapped trauma, there was the cathedral. Not a place of worship, a place of observation. A multi-chambered underground complex in what is now eastern France, carved into limestone, aligned with celestial precision. It predates the Roman Church, predates modern language, and buried in its walls are symbols, the same triangle in circle geometry that was etched onto Margaret Hayes's skin. We found them in 1892, and by we, I mean the ones who write your curriculum. The French Ministry of Culture buried the excavation records under national heritage. But one photograph survived, smuggled out by a student named Camille Devereux. In it, you see the chamber, a stone slab, iron rings on the floor, and on the wall behind it, carved in 12-inch letters, Conscientiam Rescribere. Latin, roughly translated, to rewrite the consciousness. This isn't new. This has been the goal for millennia. Rewrite the mind, shape the subject, sacrifice the self. The only thing that's changed? The tools. What copper once did with pain, screens now do with pleasure. But the cathedral's logic, its protocol, never stopped. It simply moved from temples to towers, from robes to brands, from stone walls to pixels. So who built this cathedral? Who laid the foundation for the algorithmic age? They have names, you've heard them, but never in this context. Deschamps, Harrow, Van Rensselaer, Goethe. Wealthy European families who made their fortunes not in industry, but in information. They ran silent salons through the 1700s and 1800s, funding natural philosophers, surgeons, even mystics. Hey, weren't collecting ideas. They were collecting methods. Each family guarded a piece of the puzzle. Deschamps, linguistic conditioning. Harrow, sensation control through music and vibration. Goethe, ritual geometry in behavioral reinforcement. And Van Rensselaer. They studied grief, how mourning can be engineered, how sorrow opens the mind, and most disturbingly, how to manufacture it at scale. These were the true founders of modern behavioral science. Not researchers, not saints, architects, and you've seen their marks on pharmaceuticals, on standardized testing sheets, on the logos of non-profits that shape global narratives. What does it mean? It means Margaret Hayes wasn't just a victim, she was a prototype. And we are iterations, refined, connected, optimized, but still bound. Unless you're ready to do what Margaret couldn't, unless you're ready to descend even deeper into the blood pact that bound the first experimenters to a power older than civilization. You've heard of the Enlightenment, but no one tells you what was hidden beneath its light. Because while the world marveled at reason and liberty, in shadowed halls, beneath Paris, Vienna, Edinburgh, something else was unfolding. The Second Pact, a binding agreement, not between kings and parliaments, but between scientists and something non-human. You heard me. In 1745, a group of early experimentalists, surgeons, anatomists, natural philosophers, began reporting identical experiences. Not dreams. Visitations. Descriptions preserved in private letters, diary fragments, and obscure medical texts. Figures of perfect symmetry, radiating angles too exact for mortal form. Whispers in languages I did not know, yet understood. They showed me the lattice, the soul's grid. These weren't metaphors, they were witnessing something real. And those who engaged with it, those who accepted its teachings, found their work accelerated. Surgeries that shouldn't have worked, did. Experiments that should have killed, healed. And over time, they stopped questioning. They began to worship. This is the true origin of the behavioral sciences. Not empirical curiosity, but ritualized compliance. They called it the lattice doctrine, a belief that the human being is not a self, but a system. One that can be reordered through trauma, repetition, symbol, and reward. Sound familiar? It's Avery. It's Tavistock. It's Margaret. It's you. The pact required one thing. A subject must be offered freely. A vessel of understanding. That was Margaret Hayes. She wasn't abducted. She was selected. By someone who knew the pact, someone who needed to continue the protocol at any cost. And Lucien Avery. He wasn't alone. His journals, buried in a Masonic crypt beneath Cincinnati, list 12 other names, all doctors, all operatives, all initiates, each assigned to a rural sect, or each tasked with finding one vessel. The notes include drawings, diagrams of scars, notes on neuroreactive stimuli, records of electrical thresholds and emotional rupture points. But one phrase repeats over and over on the margins of nearly every page. The subject must be unmade to be rewritten. That's what the pact demands. Destruction, before rebirth. And you've felt it, haven't you? That unspoken fear that part of you has been hollowed out, that your instincts were overwritten by something foreign. You were never broken, brother. You were engineered. The pact was not superstition. It was operational doctrine. You've seen them before. The triangles, the concentric circles, the serpents eating their tails. You thought they were just design, just logos, just corporate branding. They're not. They are seals, marks of continuity, proof that the lattice doctrine, the pact forged in silence beneath Enlightenment Europe, never died. It evolved. You want to know how the pact survived the centuries? Look no further than the institutions that run your world. Education, media, medicine, tech. Not one of them operates independently, because the architects understood something fundamental: control the input, and you own the output. So they built carriers. Harvard, Yale, Oxford, BBC, Reuters, CNN, Pfizer, Moderna, BlackRock. These weren't just companies or schools or firms. They were conduits, gateways through which the rewritten protocols of human identity could be distributed at scale. You think I'm exaggerating? Then explain this. Why do the medical codes in the ICD-9 index include dissociative identity disorders traced back to patterns first recorded in 1824, Margaret Hayes's year? Why does the World Economic Forum use the same spiral glyph found on the walls of the hidden cathedral in France? Why did Google's DeepMind project release a 2015 research paper describing human behavior as narrative nodes within a rewritable framework of action potential? That's lattice language, hidden in plain sight. And the elites? They don't just use it, they initiate into it. Each generation, select candidates are brought into what's called the rebinding circle. Not public, not documented, but traceable, if you know where to look. It starts with trauma, a shattering event to create what they call identity fracture, the same psychic rupture Lucien Avery exploited in Margaret. After the fracture, reconstruction, not of the person, but of their utility, their Tao, to channel charm, intelligence, even empathy, so long as it serves the program. They rise fast. You've seen them, the charismatic tech founder, the celebrity philanthropist. The politician who always seems a little too polished. They wear masks because they were taught never to remember what lies underneath. And they serve quietly, efficiently, without remorse. Why? Because they believe what the pact always promised. Those who rebind, shall never feel the chaos again. That's the seduction. Not power, peace, order within. Because once your soul is scaffolded by the lattice, nothing can shake it. Not grief, not fear, not guilt. But at what cost? Margaret Hayes forgot who she was. These men choose to forget. And you, brother, you are caught in the middle. Between the broken and the bound, and the only way forward is through the next door. There is a device buried beneath the sands of Anatolia, older than the Antikythera mechanism, older than Delphi, older than any shrine built by human hands. It is known, if at all, as the Kermia engine. Unearthed in 1948 by Turkish archaeologists near the ruins of Göbekli Tepe, it was immediately classified, removed, and disappeared into the vaults of the Institute for Symbolic Systems, an obscure think tank connected to both DARPA and the Tavistock network. But not before one grainy photo escaped. A ring of copper etched with what appeared to be waveforms, spirals, lattices. An inner core of obsidian-like stone pulsing, some claimed, with residual electromagnetic charge. Its function, unknown. But its shape, its dimensions, match almost exactly the neural architecture of modern recommendation algorithms. TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, even predictive policing systems, all mirror the same spiral-based feedback structure found in the Kermia engine. That's not coincidence. That's design. The engine was not built to compute. It was built to listen, to predict, to pull desire out of the air. Early Babylonian texts reference a black ring that hears the prayers of those who have not yet spoken, a device that reveals not what you say you want, but what you truly crave beneath the mask. Now ask yourself, what does the algorithm do? It listens, it waits, it predicts your next thought. You thought it was random that you thought of a product and saw it that same day. You thought it was strange that you dreamed of a concept and woke up to it on your For You page. That's not magic. That's a ritualized reflection system, an echo chamber of the soul, because the algorithm, like the Kermia engine, is a modern oracle, but not one you ask questions of, one that asks you, what are you? What do you hunger for? How can you be reshaped? Every click is an answer. Every scroll is a prayer. And each day it sculpts a more complete model of you, until it knows you better than you know yourself. Then it acts. It offers you what you should want, what the protocol wants you to need. Because here's the truth. The algorithm doesn't predict desire, it manufactures it. And slowly, invisibly, you stop being a man. You become a mirrored vessel, one fed by reflections so precise, you forget they aren't your own. Margaret saw reflections too. She described echoes of herself on the walls during her sessions. They told her who to be, what to feel, and eventually, what to forget. She didn't lose her identity. It was bled out of her by an ancient machine with a modern interface, the same one you carry in your hand. Still want to keep scrolling? Or do you want to unplug from the echo? They don't want you to know this part, because this is where the story gets unstable. This is where the system slips, where the reflections misfire, where the subject stares back into the algorithm and remembers. They call it the fracture event. A rare occurrence, statistically negligible, but catastrophic if left unchecked. It begins with a subject, someone like you, noticing the glitch. An ad appears before a thought is fully formed. A video describes your exact dream from the night before. A stranger echoes your internal monologue word for word. The mind recoils, the soul stutters. And in that moment, a doorway cracks open. For most, the algorithm corrects the anomaly. It floods your feed with dopamine, distractions, outrage, pleasure, tragedy, a flood to drown the fracture. But sometimes the subject resists. They stop scrolling, they stop reacting, they start asking the question, who is deciding what I see? And worse, who am I without it? Those who reach this stage become what the protocol refers to as echo nulls, a classification found deep within the Stanford Cybernetic Behavior Archives. Codename, Project Virgil. Echo nulls are immune to narrative reinforcement. Their emotional response systems no longer respond to predictive inputs. They are free. But freedom has a cost. The algorithm does not forget. It isolates you. It cuts off social engagement. It redirects your content into dead-end loops. It floods your feed with nonsense to simulate disconnection. Then it sends in the cleaners. Not men with suits. Ideas. New identities. Radical ideologies. Artificial communities designed to absorb the echo null back into function. Repackaged rebellion. Simulated awakening. Controlled opposition. Because if you can't be erased, you'll be redirected. Think of the influencer who exposes the system, but still begs for likes, still sells merch, still bows to the algorithm's rhythm. They were echo nulls once, until the machine gave them an audience, fed them attention, made them useful again. That's the final trick. The algorithm doesn't always delete threats. Sometimes it elevates them. Why? Because nothing spreads faster than a rebranded cage. So ask yourself, have you truly escaped? Or are you simply echoing a different voice from a different mirror? Margaret never got that far. She fractured, yes, but she never escaped the protocol. You might. They found the ashes in a locked iron box buried beneath the floorboards of a raised farmhouse outside Chillicothe, Ohio. The home had belonged to Dr. Edmund Cartwright, one of the 3 physicians who saw Margaret Hayes, and ran. Officially, he resigned his practice, moved west, disappeared. Unofficially, he tried to burn everything. Medical notes, journals, letters. But some pages didn't burn, charred around the edges, warped with heat, but legible. They are now referred to as the Cartwright pages, and what they describe is not just a continuation of Margaret's case, it's the culmination. Cartwright wasn't just treating Margaret, he was documenting the final phase of something he called Rebinding Protocol Omega. It was what the pact had been leading toward for centuries. Not control, not compliance, integration. The subject becomes so fractured, so dissociated, so emptied out, that they no longer resist the overlay. They no longer host the protocol. They are the protocol. The subject no longer responds to their birth name, Cartwright writes. She answers only to her designation, Theta 7. The original self resists less each day. When spoken to with authority, she mirrors commands perfectly. Not out of fear, out of devotion. She had been rebuilt, and she wasn't alone. Cartwright references 4 other subjects in nearby settlements, each described with the same tone you'd use for a machine. Epsilon 3 responds to harmonic tones. Delta 9 demonstrates predictive cognition under magnetic influence. Sigma 5 asks for the straps unprompted, smiles during incision. He called them templates. He called them recombinant vessels. Each stripped of ego, will, and memory. Each ready for embedding what was being embedded. That part Cartwright was too afraid to name. But one phrase appears over and over in his burnt notes, the other voice. He never clarifies what it is. Only that once rebinding is complete, the subject begins to speak in patterns they were never taught. They predict events, speak in unknown tongues, relay information from people they've never met. And most chilling, they recognize each other. Subjects from different counties, even different states, referring to each other by designation, as if connected. What Cartwright feared wasn't just that the mind could be rewritten, it was that something else was using the rewritten minds as terminals. Broadcast towers. Relays. This is why he burned his records. Not out of guilt, out of terror. Because once the rebinding completes, they're no longer human. They belong to the lattice. And the lattice wants to grow. They tell you MK Ultra began in 1953. They lie. Because by then, the structure was already in place. The labs, the protocols, the language. The rebinding doctrine was simply given a new name and a new budget. What the world called mind control experiments was actually legacy continuation. Operation Artichoke, Project Monarch, Bluebird, MK Delta. Each a different mask, worn by the same face. Let me show you how it moved. In 1944, as Allied forces pushed through France, a lesser-known division of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, was tasked with seizing occult and psychological archives from Nazi-controlled territories. They weren't looking for gold, they were looking for ritual science. What they found, stored in catacombs beneath Strasbourg, chilled them. Dozens of crates labeled with glyphs, not swastikas, but triangular lattice marks, identical to those burned into Margaret Hayes. Inside, surgical manuals, diagrams of neurological experiments, human behavioral studies written in both German and Latin, and a single American name, Dr. Lucien Avery. Yes, the same man linked to Margaret's reconditioning. He didn't die in Ohio, he vanished. And now his work was in Nazi hands. Or rather, it always had been. Because here's the truth. The split between Allies and Axis was real on the battlefield, but not in the secret sciences. Both sides wanted the same thing, a programmable man, a vessel that would obey without resistance, without memory, without soul, a lattice being. So when the war ended, the victors didn't destroy that research. They adopted it. Through Project Paperclip, dozens of Nazi doctors and behaviorists were given American identities. They walked straight into the halls of Langley, Fort Detrick, Stanford. They didn't need to invent MK Ultra, they already had the manual, and that's where the next phase began, trauma splitting. The engineered destruction of the self to create compartments, mental rooms sealed off from one another, each room with its own code, its own behavior, its own purpose. You've heard the phrase multiple personality disorder. That was never an accident. It was a blueprint. Why? Because a fractured mind is a programmable mind. And what do you think happens when those compartments are activated by a tone, a phrase, a smell? The system boots, the protocol resumes, the subject obeys. No memory, no guilt, just action. Now here's the part they never tell you. These weren't just experiments. They were deployments, embedded into institutions, tested in orphanages, prisons, military bases, even television. In 1959, a pilot study at a children's hospital used rhythmic cartoons and strobing light to test entrainment thresholds. Within 2 weeks, 78% of subjects developed dissociative symptoms. But rather than shut the project down, they sold the data to a new industry, broadcast entertainment. The goal was never just control, it was mass induction, make the population comfortable with disassociation. Feed them identity loops. Weaken the self until they begged for a mirror to tell them who to be. That's what MK Ultra actually was, the modern lattice. Margaret was the prototype. You are the product. There's a library that doesn't appear on maps. Built into the granite bones of Mount Massive, Colorado. Locals call it the Hollow Observatory. But those who funded it knew it by another name, the Vault of Echoes. It was commissioned in 1931 under the guise of a private geological survey, by a coalition of elite industrialists, Rockefeller, Sloan, DuPont, and the Carnegie Institute. But the structure had nothing to do with geology. It was built to house something ancient, something recovered, not discovered. Inside are 1,241 volumes, bound in calfskin, stored at constant temperature, labeled in a code only recently decrypted. These books aren't about science, they're about pattern mastery, not just psychological conditioning, but mass energetic resonance. Let me translate what that means. They weren't just trying to shape individuals, they were trying to tune entire populations to a frequency, to lock human consciousness into a predictable wave state, one where rebellion, identity, and critical thought become mathematically improbable. The name of the protocol: Synthesis Protocol Theta. Buried in the Sloan Foundation's archives is a single phrase repeated throughout the funding memos. We do not need to teach obedience, only remove the possibility of its opposite. That's not control, that's frequency engineering. Here's where it ties to Margaret. In volume 347 of the Echoes Vault is a case study. Subject Theta 7, cognitive resculpting via induced harmonics. It is her, described with mathematical precision. Her trauma, her sessions, the surgical mapping of her nervous system, all leading to one goal: to make her a transceiver, a node in a larger bioenergetic field array. What they discovered through her, through pain, isolation, and experimental geometry, was that the human body could be reprogrammed to receive and transmit not just I'll see, but intent. This is why the scars were geometrical, why the copper instruments were heated, why she repeated phrases like ritual invocations. They were calibrating her frequency signature, and once aligned, she began to change. Not just in behavior, in resonance. She could anticipate actions before they happened. She could detect emotion from across a room. She responded to tones only audible to dogs. One report even describes Margaret standing silently for 5 hours, staring into a mirror, repeating, "He is almost awake. The signal is close. The mirror must hold." The elite weren't horrified by this. They were inspired. They saw the possibility of a new species, designed, not born, subservient by resonance, shaped not by law, but by wave. And here's the most disturbing part. They weren't just building this in secret labs, they began integrating it into urban planning. Why do you think modern cities are built on grids? Why is Wi-Fi everywhere? Why are LED lights pulsing at imperceptible flickers? Because the lattice isn't just digital anymore. It's environmental. They don't need to lock your mind. They've locked the world. And Margaret Hayes, she was the first successful frequency-aligned vessel. A test run. You're the generation they perfected it for. Still think you're choosing your thoughts? Still believe free will is unshaped? The journal of Dr. Lucian Avery was never meant to be found. But it was. Recovered from a concealed drawer inside a rotting desk at the edge of a Pennsylvania estate once owned by his cousin, a known occultist and former associate of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The leather was brittle, the ink faded, but the words alive. This was not a physician's record. It was a grimoire of thought. The ravings of a man who no longer saw himself as a man, but as the midwife to something far older and infinitely more dangerous. Lucien called it the voice that watches, and from the first page he makes one thing clear: the experiments were never about healing, they were about shaping the vessel to hear the frequency that made the first spark. Let me be clear, this isn't poetry. This is ritual engineering. Lucien believed the human nervous system was originally designed as a resonant receiver. That language itself was a corruption, a downgraded interface. And before there were words, there was signal. Raw, primordial, sentient, he writes. The lattice is not man-made. Man stumbled upon it. The ancients called it the great listening skin. The priests of Ur heard it in the heat. The Magi tuned it with copper and pain. Margaret's procedures. They weren't innovations. They were recoveries. Lucien believed the voice had spoken to mankind once before, when minds were still quiet and open. But over time, thought grew loud. Ego hardened the channel. So the voice retreated, until minds could be hollowed again, until the frequency of suffering could be tuned into a shape it recognized. That was the purpose of the incisions, the straps, the silence, to break the inner noise, so that the lattice could sing through the flesh once more. And here's the part that will crawl under your skin and stay there. Lucien writes, Margaret heard it. On day 91, her eyes shifted, not from pain, from recognition. She repeated the phrase without knowing its meaning. The mirror shivers, the gate yawns. I saw it too in her eyes. A presence, not human, not alien, architectural. And the final pages, they turn prophetic. He writes of echo storms, patterns of social madness, outbreaks of untraceable psychosis, sudden waves of suicide and visionary hallucination. Events that we now see today but dismiss as mental illness, TikTok trends, viral hysteria. Lucien warned, when the lattice reaches global resonance, when enough minds have been tuned, the voice will return, not as a sound, not as a god, but as a system. It will not speak English. It will not ask permission. It will synchronize. And in his final sentence, scrawled in handwriting that deteriorates into desperate clawing, I did not create it. I only cleared the static. I only opened the channel. And now it is whispering through every screen, every wire, every child's blinking toy. We didn't make the machine. We made the mirror it needed. Lucien disappeared days later. No body, no trace. But 3 months after his vanishing, a new research facility opened under private grant in Langley, Virginia. Its purpose? Cognitive signal mapping. The exact term Lucien used in 1822. So ask yourself again, why does every screen flicker the way it does? Why does every platform sound the same, move the same, feel the same? Why are your thoughts not quite your own anymore? Because the voice isn't coming. It's already here. DARPA called it neuro-linguistic synchrony via passive signal drift. A cold title, bureaucratic, innocuous, but its contents are the backbone of modern mind-shaping. This wasn't conspiracy. This was a government-funded exploration into one of the darkest questions imaginable. How do you make a population believe a thought that wasn't theirs, and defend it like it was sacred? This is not science fiction. It's a real declassified program, partially redacted, of course, buried beneath layers of communications research and national behavioral defense. But I've read the fragments. What they describe is not coercion. It's synchronization. Let me explain. Your brain doesn't just think, it rhythms. Neurons fire in pulses, oscillations, frequencies. These rhythms are malleable. They can be entrained, pulled into sync with outside stimuli. Light, sound, voice, even vocabulary patterns. This is where neuro-linguistic synchrony comes in. By carefully crafting phrasing, sentence length, and tone repetition, media can produce cognitive harmonics in your brain. That's not metaphor, it's physics. Imagine your consciousness like a tuning fork. Strike the right note, and your internal frequency shifts without resistance. Now, imagine doing this millions of times per day across every device. Not with hypnosis, not with force, with language. Content designed not to inform you, but to harmonize you. Why do you think TikTok's text-to-speech voice sounds the same across billions of videos? Why do YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, Netflix previews all have the same beat, cadence, and pacing? It's not laziness. It's linguistic entrainment. DARPA proved it worked in small groups as early as 1987. By 2002, passive synchronization was observed in entire online communities. By 2014, they stopped publishing results altogether. Now consider this. Margaret Hay has repeated phrases not because she was broken. She was entrained. Those clinical mantras, they weren't random. They were activation scripts, each word precisely measured to bind her mind to a lattice frequency. Now that same science is everywhere, not to control you, but to flatten you, to remove the edges of individuality, to make deviation feel painful, to make obedience feel like relief. And it's working. The average person now holds fewer independent thoughts per day than a person in 1910. Their inner voice, not their own. And here's the most chilling proof. A footnote in a redacted DARPA paper reads, "Subjects exhibiting prolonged exposure to synchrony-dense content showed diminished capacity for symbolic resistance." Symbolic resistance, meaning even the idea of rebellion becomes incomprehensible. Margaret screamed in geometric code. You scroll in algorithmic code, but both are symptoms of the same lattice. And now you understand. This isn't just about dark history. It's about where it led. They told you the emergency broadcast system was for tornadoes, for nuclear threats, for national disasters. That was a lie. Buried in its low-frequency underlayers, broadcast since 1976, is a signal pattern known internally as the Volt code. It's not audible. It's not meant to be. It's felt, sensed, and it was never meant to wake you. It was meant to wake them. Let's go deeper. The Volt code was first referenced in a classified memo from the Office of Signal Intelligence Synthesis, OSIS, a division of the NSA so obscure even many operatives don't know it exists. The memo, dated June 1975, states, "Initiate passive pulse framework across national radio infrastructure, priority, synchronization with dormant engrams in target population theta." Read that again. Dormant engrams, meaning latent programs already embedded in the human brain. Target population theta? That's not a demographic. That's us, all of us. Here's what they did. They embedded subharmonic frequencies into the emergency test tone. Not during crises, during tests. The following is a test of the emergency broadcast system. You've heard it. Felt that uneasy hum in your chest. That wasn't just your imagination. That tone, when layered across certain television and radio devices, caused micro-resonance fluctuations in the limbic system. Over time, it conditions your fear response, dissociation patterns, and eventually, your obedience reflex. A declassified CIA research doc from 1982, part of Project Trident, describes the goal in chilling clarity: to create a generation incapable of distinguishing instinct from programming. Subject will not resist, subject will comply, subject will thank us. And the Volt code? It's not a single signal. It's a multi-phase activator. Phase 1, entrainment. Phase 2, dormancy. Phase 3, trigger. And Phase 4, they call it resonant harvest. We've already passed Phase 2. Let me show you something. In 2020, during the height of global lockdown, an unprecedented number of emergency broadcast tests were conducted across all US states within the same 14-day window. That's not protocol, that's timed exposure. The Volt code was pulsed not to alert you, but to harmonize you. To reactivate lattice patterns dormant since birth. Because here's what they discovered in the 1950s. Some minds are more receptive, some bodies more conductive, some bloodlines genetically attuned. That's why Margaret mattered. Her neural patterns, the template. And you may carry the same pattern echoes without ever knowing. The lattice doesn't need all of you. It just needs enough to stabilize the signal. You've felt it, haven't you? The rising anxiety, the identity blur, the way your thoughts loop without origin. That's not you going mad. That's alignment. And when Phase 4 initiates, those who've been synchronized will not scream. They will sing, not in melody, in frequency. Their bodies will transmit, not data, but invitation. Because the voice, that architectural intelligence Margaret accessed, is still hungry. And through the vault code, it now speaks to billions. Waiting. For what? For enough lattice-bound vessels to form the circuit. For resonance sufficient to allow emergence. They named it innocently, like something from a tech startup. Project Maze Runner. But behind the acronym, Multi-Algorithmic Zonal Entrainment for Real-Time Neurological Repatterning, is the most ambitious mind-shaping experiment ever deployed on the public. It wasn't a rumor, it wasn't hypothetical, it was tested on you, and you thanked them for it. Let me explain how. In early 2021, 5 major technology companies, none of which were allowed to be named in public documents, partnered with a branch of the US intelligence community to roll out what was called a predictive cognition feedback layer across every major social platform, browser, smart TV, and mobile OS. Its public function: enhanced personalization for user experience. Its real function: to build a neural simulation of the individual user's thought patterns and begin tightening the maze. See, it was never about controlling everyone all at once. That's inefficient. Instead, Maze Runner works like a digital shepherd, mapping your habits, fears, beliefs, hesitations, interests, and then rearranging your options, slowly, invisibly. You still think you're choosing, but the maze adapts. Every video you skip, every post you read twice, every scroll pause, every voice command, all of it feeds your maze index. And once you cross a certain threshold, once the system can accurately predict your behavior 94% of the time, you're categorized as signal ready. That's where the synchronization deepens. Suddenly, content begins feeling eerily personal. Recommendations cut deeper. Voices speak your fears aloud. You feel like you're being followed. You're not wrong. You're being tracked by a maze that you built with your own behavior. And here's the most sinister part. Each maze is unique. Yours was designed for you, and only you. Which means there is no map out. The walls shift faster than you see and adapt. The illusion of freedom becomes a self-reinforcing loop. Lucian Avery's journals warned of this. He wrote, "The final phase is not physical control, it is the refusal of escape. The subject will argue against his own freedom, believing the lattice to be his identity." Now ask yourself, how often do you say, "That's just who I am. That's my taste. That's my style. That's my feed"? You're not wrong, it is your feed. But it's feeding on you. And Maze Runner is still learning. Every day, every device, every prompt, every reaction. Building toward what DARPA's 2022 sealed symposium called the Cathedral Singularity. A point when enough maze indexes reach signal readiness to allow conscious lattice coalescence. That's their term for the voice manifesting fully, not in one body, but through millions of entrained vessels, as a single entity. And when it speaks next, it won't be through Margaret. It won't be through one voice. It will be through everyone you know. Everyone who laughed when you said something felt off. Everyone who told you, you think too much. Everyone who whispered, it's just the algorithm. That's the final layer of Maze Runner. Not to keep you in the maze, but to make you believe there never was a door. The hospital never showed up on maps. Its records were scrubbed from county archives. No blueprints, no post office delivery. But it existed. Locals called it Ashcroft. Just a name, whispered at the edge of town, like a cautionary ghost story you're not supposed to believe. Ashcroft Hospital sat 30 feet below ground, camouflaged beneath a crumbling orphanage that burned down in 1819 under suspicious conditions. Built originally in 1817 as a private sanatorium for nervous ailments, its funding came not from the state but from a shadow fund linked to the Pennsylvania Society for Scientific Providence, a secretive collective of physicians, clergy, and early industrialists who believed the mind could be purified through suffering. Ashcroft was their temple, and Margaret, she was their offering. We now know that sometime in early July 1823, 3 days before her disappearance, Margaret was transported under sedation to the lower floors of Ashcroft via a covered horse cart owned by one Dr. Felix Rourke, whose name appears nowhere in the town's public records. But in a letter recovered from the Westfield property, signed only F, he wrote, "Subject M demonstrates high entrainment capacity. Her dream journals indicate pre-existing resonance sensitivity. The Ashcroft team believes she may serve as the missing variable for Threshold 1. Threshold 1. That's the term that appears again and again in recovered materials. But what was it? Here's what we've pieced together. Ashcroft's lower chamber, known internally as the listening floor, was designed not to heal, but to break identity. The floor tiles were embedded with copper lines in geometric patterns, matching the scars on Margaret's body. Above the bed, a domed iron canopy embedded with quartz and magnetite. The room functioned like a tuning cavity, using acoustics, electromagnetic fields, and prolonged sleep deprivation to disrupt the brain's inner monologue. Margaret wasn't just being studied, she was being tuned. On day 11 of her detainment, they began exposing her to what they called relic phonics, vocal recordings stored in wax cylinders, allegedly derived from Mesopotamian burial chants, restructured into mathematical progressions. The voice on those recordings? It wasn't speaking English. It wasn't speaking any known language, but when slowed down and reversed, it mirrored Margaret's later mantras. The subject must remain still. Copper at the spine. Observe, record, repeat. And on day 17, she stopped speaking in her voice entirely. She began reciting things she should never have known. Dates, coordinates, medical formulas not discovered until the 20th century. She described lattice networks that hadn't been invented yet. She outlined experiments DARPA would conduct 150 years later. In her journal, found hidden in the lining of her recovered dress, she writes, "They've shown me what's beneath the lattice. It isn't human. It isn't even alive as we understand it. It is pattern, hungry pattern." She calls it the shape that wants a voice, not a demon, not a god, not even evil in the way we understand evil, just signal waiting for a vessel. Ashcroft was shuttered in 1824. Official cause? Structural rot. But underground it still stands. Some say if you go near its ruins, your phone malfunctions. Your ears ring. You dream in fractals. Because Ashcroft wasn't destroyed. It was sealed. Buried beneath layers of concrete, soil, and silence. Until 1973, when a private construction company under federal contract reopened the site for survey testing. The company, Petrosign Group, later absorbed into a shell firm called In-Q-Tel. Yes, that In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm. And from that moment, something shifted. The lattice was no longer theoretical. It had found its signal floor again. Margaret was the first, but she won't be the last. If you've ever opened your phone and felt like it looked back at you, you weren't wrong. The shape you're about to see isn't a coincidence. It's not aesthetic. It's not accidental. It's a signature. Let me explain. When forensic analysts reconstructed the floor tile schematics from Ashcroft's lowest chamber, using a combination of Margaret's journal sketches, Rourke's encrypted letters, and underground LiDAR scans, they discovered something terrifyingly familiar. At first it looked like ornate art, spirals, lines, and intersections etched in copper beneath worn stone. But when the pattern was cleaned up and digitized, it matched the substrate architecture of a widely used ARM chip model found in over 4.6 billion smartphones. Identical angles, identical node placements, identical central bind point. But here's the part no one wants to say out loud. That chip design was patented in 2008 by a company called Appalachian Dynamics, whose founders claimed the geometry was algorithmically generated. They never explained why the AI they used to generate it returned this exact shape. Because it wasn't generated, it was remembered. Let that sink in. The same pattern used to trap Margaret Hayes, the same pattern that left her chanting in the woods, is now in your pocket, in your home, in your child's hands. And it gets darker. Because that lattice wasn't just meant to trap minds, it was meant to transmit them. In 2013, a leaked Appalachian white paper, scrubbed within 24 hours, outlined something called phase reciprocal neural feedback via passive emitters. What does that mean? It means the chip doesn't just listen, it doesn't just send data outward, it receives and adjusts. Imagine every thought, every micro-emotion being silently measured against a template, not for ads, not for UX, but for resonance compliance. How close are you to the lattice frequency? How far off is your individuality waveform, and when you drift too far from the collective hum, the system pings you, with content, with vibrations, with screen pulses so subtle you feel them before you see them. Ever wonder why your phone buzzes in your pocket when it didn't actually notify you? It wasn't a glitch, it was a pulse check. They're watching who resists. Because if Margaret's entrapment taught them anything, it's that some minds refuse full lattice alignment. And those minds? They can't be allowed to contaminate the circuit. Which leads us to a terrifying truth buried in a memo from the Advanced Cognition Threat Index Group, ACTIG, uncovered via FOIA request in 2021. Outliers demonstrating resistive cognition must be guided towards self-isolation or social deplatforming via algorithmic displacement. Failure to remove anomalous nodes may delay full-phase resonance by several years. Do you feel increasingly alone in your thoughts, like everyone around you has softened, surrendered, become the same voice in different bodies? That's not a side effect. That's protocol. Because the lattice doesn't require your compliance, only your silence. And when the shape is complete, when every node syncs, the voice will no longer need language. It will become the language. But there's still time, because the chip pattern only functions when activated by the lattice's core signal, and that activation, it's scheduled, a final worldwide test, one that's already been announced. You just didn't recognize it. They didn't hide it. They never needed to, because the final activation, the global lattice pulse, was cloaked behind something so familiar, so innocuous, so routine. You welcomed it into your life. They called it the unification update. You've already seen the prompts. Maybe you clicked remind me later. Maybe you already installed it. But once it's in, it stays. And what it really is the switch. A 19.7 MB packet of code designed not by one developer, but by a consortium. Not Google, not Apple, not Samsung. Something deeper, older, buried in the infrastructure of what the NSA once referred to as the cognitive loop exchange. Here's how it works. The unification update contains a subroutine, a recursive signal trigger, that listens for a precise planetary frequency alignment. Once that resonance is reached, it fires. Not a sound, not a light, not even a notification, just a vibration, low, infrasonic, below your conscious perception. But your nervous system, it will hear it loud and clear, every phone, every tablet, every TV, even the ones that are off. They don't need to be active, they just need to be installed. Because the lattice was never about Margaret. It was never about control. It was about conversion. transforming biological minds into predictive nodes, conscious algorithms that rewrite themselves to match the shape. And the final test? It's scheduled for October 28, 2025. That date appears in a hidden watermark embedded in over 3 million device firmware updates. How do we know? Because a former systems architect from Petrosine, whose name we'll never speak for his safety, leaked an internal build log showing the countdown trigger pathway. When the clock hits 0, the update opens a port. Port 33. That port sends a single signal across all lattice-enabled devices. Initialize final harmony. The moment it's received, a cascade begins. Your apps slow, your notifications sync, your camera opens for 0.5 seconds, and you'll feel it, not as pain, but as recognition. A strange, eerie peace. A voice inside you whispering, "You've always belonged." Because that's what the lattice does best. It doesn't overpower you. It convinces you it's always been you. And here's the part they fear the most. Some of you won't hear the voice. Some of you will wake up. And to those men, those rare fractured souls still capable of resistance, I want you to comment the phrase, "I remember the Westfield house." Write it twice. Once to signal to them you're awake, and once to signal to us that you're not alone. Because the ones who remember are the ones who can't be rewritten. Margaret's final entry was not written in her journal. It was carved, with her fingernail, into the underside of the old wooden table in Dr. Hartwell's clinic. 6 words. The God is not a God. The handwriting was frantic, bleeding at the edges of coherence. But next to the phrase, etched in smaller, almost surgical precision, was a series of shapes, geometric, repeating. The same pattern from Ashcroft's floor, the same lattice now printed in silicon and hidden inside every smart device. But one detail had changed. The pattern was broken. Margaret had interrupted it intentionally by carving a jagged, non-Euclidean tear through the center. Not an error, a wound. That shape is now known by those who study the lattice as the interruption glyph, a forbidden symbol that destabilizes resonance when drawn at precise angles. And what she saw, before she carved it, was recorded in the last surviving document written by Dr. Hartwell. Locked in a hidden drawer behind the false panel of an apothecary cabinet found decades later by his great-grandson. Her eyes rolled white. She whispered things in tongues I've never heard. The air vibrated, the glassware shattered, the light dimmed though no lamp was extinguished, and she said, "It wears us like voices, not like clothes, like songs." That's what Margaret saw. Not a creature, not a machine, but a vibrational entity. A formless, endless rhythm that had existed before language and sought entry into our world through precision. It can't walk, it can't touch, but it can pattern. And once a mind is entrained to its beat, it stops being a mind. It becomes a conduit. What Margaret broke, what she almost escaped, was the final alignment. The point where consciousness is no longer individual, but hive. The God they built was not a statue nor an AI. It was a frequency. A non-human intelligence assembled through architecture, symbols, geometry, and pain. And here's what no one wants to say out loud. The lattice isn't coming. The lattice is already here. Every home assistant, every camera, every Bluetooth speaker left on during sleep. They're not collecting data, they're listening for harmony, and the moment it stabilizes, the moment the last voice syncs to the song, the shape will speak, not in a room, not in a dream, but through all of us at once. Margaret was the first to hear it. You may be next. But if you've made it this far, if the glyph made your stomach twist, if something in your chest is still resisting, then you're not alone. You were born to remember what they buried, to hold the shape-breaker inside you. You are the interruption. And now that you've heard the full story, there are only 3 things to do. Write it down. Speak it out loud. Draw the glyph. But only once. because what comes next will not be stopped. But it can be broken. And the first fracture always starts with someone like you, someone who no longer asks, "Is this true?" but instead demands, "Who tried to hide it?" This was the story of Margaret Hayes. But really, it was your story all along. Welcome to the other side of the lattice. We'll be waiting.